Hello, Music 12. We are here at the end of the semester. This is our last lecture, last set of lecture slides as well for Chapter 13, Part 2. This is titled Greatness and Genre, again from our textbook Resonances. I did make some additions to this chapter as it was a little bit light, so we included some extra material about another really important group that I thought should have received some recognition as well. So let's go ahead and begin. We're going to look at three primary examples in this chapter, but as always, we have a lot of little side subjects that come up as well, just as the result of music being interconnected. And in this chapter in particular, Greatness and Genre, we're dealing with musicians who, in my opinion, looked beyond the limitations that genre can have and started to bridge gaps in music, but also create some very new compelling music through the fusion of ideas from different places and different people. So let's go ahead and begin. The preceding discussion about the Pulitzer Prize for Music has essentially been a discussion about greatness in genre. For most of the 20th century, the Pulitzer Committee restricted their concept of greatness to classical music. In the late 20th century, that expanded it to include jazz. In the 21st century, we have expanded further to include hip-hop. What will come next? We can only wait and see. However, it is clear that the committee has historically perceived some genres as superior to others and continues to see greatness only in specific realms. Some of the best performing artists, however, clearly do not place these same limitations on music. In this section, we will explore the work of individual artists and performing ensembles that have excelled in the realm of classical music, but put as much or more energy into other genres. All of these artists would disagree that any one musical genre is superior to another. Instead, they hear good music everywhere and are inspired by a variety of styles and approaches. And here we see, of course, a mix of all the different genres. And like we discussed in previous chapters, genres are helpful in defining things, but when do they also become limitations? When do they start to prevent different collaborations between artists just due to these words, really? What prevents musicians from different backgrounds from collaborating with each other? So our first example is going to talk about this performing art group of the 21st century called Alarm Will Sound. Alarm Will Sound is an instrumental ensemble based in New York City. The group was initially formed by students at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. While pursuing degrees in music, founders Gavin Chuck and Alan Pearson got into conversation about the limited opportunities for the performance of new music. This is a standard term for recent, often experimental art music compositions, many of which might be classified as avant-garde, and especially minimalist music. They recruited a group of interested performers and started a concert series. Upon graduating from Eastman, the members of the ensemble decided that they wanted to keep working together, and in 2001, Alarm Will Sound was founded. So here we see Alarm Will Sound using the instruments of a standard orchestra, but in a much smaller kind of chamber music environment, making minimalist and often avant-garde new music that has been recently composed. The group's first concert under their name took place on May 24th, 2001 in New York City's Miller Theater. Unsurprisingly, given their collective interests, the program explored the music of minimalist composer Steve Reich, born in 1936. Reich was at the forefront of the development of minimalism in the 1960s. Although minimalist composers take a variety of approaches to their work, they share an interest in developing extended compositions from limited musical material. So when we talk about question number one, we're mentioning right here, what are the characteristics of minimalism? There have many approaches to their work, but the main interest is developing extended compositions from a small, limited amount of musical material. Part two is down here. Reich himself has always detested the term minimalism, preferring the more descriptive pattern and process music. This is fitting. Most minimalist composers employ fixed transformative processes in their work. Reich's earliest experiments were completed using tape loops. He discovered that if he played two identical loops of audio tape at slightly different speeds, he could produce a dazzling and constantly shifting array of effects. opening up a world of sound that could have never been detected in the untransformed material. So this is always good to mention how revolutionary it must have been to have heard recorded media for the first time and also to be able to manipulate how fast it was going, how the volume could play off of a tape machine, all the different effects and splicing that you could do to sound. This was pretty phenomenal just to hear these new ways of dealing with audio. You could reverse something for the first time. No one had ever heard that sound before. So let's continue. Reich's first completed tape piece did not even use musical sounds. Instead, he built Come Out in 1966 using a clip from an interview with Daniel Hamm, one of the Harlem Six, a group of black men, mostly teenagers, who were coerced into confessing to a 1964 murder and denied adequate representation by the courts. So, question number two, we've already seen how is Reich influenced by the tape looping, but now we'll see also what was the influence for the piece itself, has kind of a historical background too. Although the men were convicted by an all-white jury in 1965, all but one of the charges were eventually overturned. In Come Out, we hear Hamm explaining the means to which he had to resort in order to convince police that he and his co-defendants had been beaten in jail and required medical attention. So this is almost a social commentary piece about the criminal justice system, you could say. Come Out was initially a byproduct of a sound collage that Reich built at the request of civil rights activist Truman Nelson, but it ended up being a broadly influential minimalist experiment. Over the course of the 13-minute work, Hamm's voice slowly dissolves into a cacophony of rhythms and timbres. The words soon become unintelligible as the listener's interest shifts to the element of pure sound. Although it is almost impossible to detect the gradual changes that are taking place, no 2 seconds of the recording are the same. Sustained attention is rewarded with an inimitable sonic experience. So this is really worth listening to. This Come Out. Again, the idea of process music, that the effects are all being really explored for the first time, but playing the same recording back over itself and noticing the small changes. Really, it's a unique sensory experience, I would say that. Check this out. Reich soon applied similar techniques to musical material, at the same time developing new approaches to facilitating gradual change over extended periods of time. Reich was a highly trained musician, having studied at the Juilliard School in New York City and Mills College in Oakland, California. That's where I went to school too. He also had omnivorous tastes. He was equally enthralled with jazz, the music of Bach and Vivaldi, rock, and Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. Later, he took opportunities to study non-Western traditions, including Balinese gamelan and West African drumming. All of these influenced his mature style. So this is another nice piece of Steve Reich's as well, called Nagoya Marimbas. Again, this idea of pattern and process being really explored in an interesting way compositionally. Now, this talks about one of my favorite Steve Reich pieces called Piano Phase. There should be a video right here as well. There we go. This is what Steve Reich says about the piece himself. Shortly after completing Come Out, I began to think about writing live instrumental music. Unfortunately, it seemed to me that at the time impossible for two human beings to perform that gradual phase shifting process, since the process was discovered with and seemed indigenous to tape recorders. On the other hand, I could think of nothing else to do with live musicians that would be as interesting as the phasing process. Finally, late in 1966, I recorded a short repeating melodic pattern played on the piano, made a tape loop of it, and then tried to play against that loop myself, exactly as if I were a second tape recorder. To my surprise, I found that while I lacked the perfection of the machine, I could give a good approximation of it while enjoying a new and extremely satisfying way of playing that was both completely worked out beforehand and yet free of reading notation, allowing me to become completely absorbed in listening while I played. Piano phase was later completely written out in musical notation, with dotted lines between one bar and the next to indicate the gradual phase shifting. The score shows that two musicians begin in unison playing the same pattern over and over again, and that while one of them stays put, the other gradually increases his or her tempo so as to slowly move one beat ahead of the other. This process is repeated until both players are back in unison, at which point the pattern is changed and the phasing process begins again. Everything is worked out, there is no improvisation, but the psychology of performance, what really happens when you play, is total involvement with the sound, total sensuous intellectual involvement. And that's from Steve Reich, again, the composer of the piece. So listen to this piece, Piano Phase. I think you might really enjoy it. It really is almost like a phenomenon for your brain to hear this phasing of the same pattern against itself on two different pianos, but that the gradual shifting is actually where the interest lies. And then hearing the pattern in different juxtapositions of itself, different patterns seem to just kind of pop out to me as I listen to it. And I always hear this piece kind of in a different way every time that I hear it because my ear is drawn to a different way of listening. So a very cool piece to listen to with headphones. I would say pause this video and check out Piano Phase by Steve Reich. So question number 3, we just kind of finished, was how does he achieve the effect of looping in his piece Come Out and Piano Phase? So in Come Out, it's the same pattern being played at slightly different speeds. Piano Phase, he wrote it not for 2 tapes, but for 2 live pianos. So the piano phasing is done by the human listening to the pattern and slowly speeding up their pattern until they achieve that phasing effect. Now let's continue on here with question number 4. We're going to get into another Steve Reich classic piece called Clapping Music, and also his piece called Music for Pieces of Wood. I think both are very excellent pieces of minimalism, or you could say process music. Let's continue. Clapping Music is a minimalist piece written by Steve Reich in 1972. It is written for 2 performers and is performed entirely by clapping. Reich and his ensemble were on tour in Europe in 1972. After a concert in Brussels, the promoter asked them if they would like to go see some flamenco music. They ended in a club and watched a pair of musicians who, by Reich's account, were terrible guitarists and singers. However, when they started clapping very loudly, Reich and his group, who were mainly percussionists, joined in. After the concert, Reich realized that he could use this as the basis for work, not least as it could be performed with only a few people rather than taking 2 trucks of equipment. So rather than moving a ton of big xylophones, marimbas, pianos, it could be performed just with your human hands. A development of the phasing technique from Reich's earlier works, such as Piano Phase, it was written when Reich wanted to, in his own words, create a piece of music that needed no instruments beyond the human body. However, he quickly found that the mechanism of phasing slowly in and out of tempo with each other was inappropriate for the simple clapping involved in producing the actual sounds that made the music. So he couldn't use his same trick of the phasing because it didn't quite work when it was just hands clapping the same way that it did for the pianos or for the tape machines. Instead of phasing, one performer claps a basic rhythm, a variation of the fundamental African bell pattern in 12/8 time, for the entirety of the piece. The other claps the same pattern, but after every 8 or 12 bars, shifts by 1/8 note to the right, skipping 1 note or rest in the pattern. So this is more about a process of shifting one of the patterns over and hearing the pattern against itself superimposed, you could say. So one player would clap that pattern over and over in the piece, basically establishing a rhythmic ostinato, a never-changing rhythmic pattern. The other player would shift the pattern by 1 note so that it would be superimposed against itself and revealing new combined patterns between the 2 clappings. So it's a combination of the notes, the rests that you hear as well, creates these very unique patterns that kind of evolve over time. Let's continue reading here. And this is just a great performance of Steve Reich here on the right. He always wears this black baseball cap, you might notice too. Performing clapping music with another person here. There's also a great app right here that you can download for your phone. If you want to learn how to do this piece, it's actually quite challenging, but this makes it very fun to learn how to do this piece and see if you have some good rhythm. Okay, I'm going to continue here. The 2 performers continue this until the second performer has shifted 12/8 notes and is hence playing the same patterns in unison with the first performer again as at the beginning. Some 144 bars later, the variation of the African bell pattern is minimal. It contains just 1 additional beat. However, this minimal addition results in a much more buttressing piece from the point of view of the variation of syncopation as the piece progresses. A typical recording of the piece, as included in Reich's works 1965 to 1995 box set, lasts just under 5 minutes. So listen to this recording of clapping music, see if you can follow along as the pattern shifts against itself. Now, continuing, music for pieces of wood, like clapping music, is a Reich composition that grew out of a desire to make music with the simplest possible instruments. It was partially inspired by Ghanaians, people of Ghana, using pieces of wood to augment clapping in their village performances. Reich's first full draft of clapping music was written for clapping and claves. Claves are, again, two pieces of wood hit together. You'll see them in this video right here. In the piece, Reich starts with a few steady rhythmic patterns and slowly adds more layers, creating a complex, interconnected rhythm structure. Perceiving many different layers of polyrhythm offer a unique and ever-shifting experience for the listeners. So this is another great piece. You can talk about its origins, going back to the Ghanaian clapping and rhythm pieces. These are two videos of the piece as well. The one on the bottom here shows the rhythms actually visually, so it might be nice to see how the patterns relate to each other. It helps you actually listen for the patterns, I think. But if you prefer to see a live version, this is available as well. I would say maybe check out both of them. Now, we've talked about Steve Reich, especially his early works, but now we're going to get into his kind of mid-career in the 1980s, and this will relate back to our group that we were talking about, Alarm Will Sound, who kind of specializes in this minimalism work like composers like Steve Reich. On their inaugural concert, Alarm Will Sound performed two large-scale Reich works for orchestral ensemble and singers. Tehillim, in 1981, composed, and The Desert Music, composed in 1983. We will consider Tehillim, which by Reich's own account represented his first attempt to engage musically with his Jewish heritage. The texts, sung in Hebrew by four female voices, are taken from the Book of Psalms. The original Hebrew word for which is Tehillim, which literally means praises. In the first movement, we hear 4 lines from Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens, God has pitched a tent for the sun. So this is talking again, question number 5. What is the inspiration for Steve Reich's piece, Tehillim? And we will listen to it in just a moment as well. We're also asking, what are the musical elements behind this piece, and how does it fit with Reich's compositional processes? So that we'll learn more about that here on slide 12. At first, a solo voice is accompanied only by tambourine without jingles, intended by Reich to evoke the small drum mentioned in Psalm 150, and clapping, another mode of rhythmic accompaniment that was in use during biblical times. We hear the entire psalm text sung to a continuous melody, which is shaped by the rhythms of the Hebrew words. This is an atypical way for Reich to open a piece of music, but he soon begins applying transformations. The second time through the melody, the singer is doubled by a clarinet, while a second percussive accompaniment of tambourine and clapping enters in canon with the first. So again, canon, rhythms against themselves that are offset in some way. Next, we hear the melody in a 2-voice canon, one singer echoing the other. Soon after the canon begins, the strings enter with sustained harmonies. At the conclusion of this turn, through the complete melody, the tempo slows and the texture fractures into a 4-voice canon. The 4 singers repeat each individual line of the psalm many times. They are doubled by electric organ, which contributes a reedy timbre, and accompanied by maracas. The sustained string harmonies gradually shift, seemingly out of time with the voices. Finally, the original soloist, again doubled by clarinet, assumes the melody once more, to the accompaniment of drums and maracas. She is briefly harmonized by one of the other singers, but the movement ends much as it began. While Tehillim is quite different from Come Out in all surface respects, We can see how Reich's basic compositional process is consistent. The textures in Tehillim, as in Come Out, are created from the increasingly complex layering of limited sound material. In the case of Tehillim, Reich relies on rhythmic and melodic canons augmented by slow-moving kaleidoscopic harmonies. I love those words right there, slow-moving kaleidoscopic harmonies. When you listen to the piece, I hope that you can listen for these things, the rhythm and melodic canons and these slow-moving harmonies as well, very typical of Reich's sound, kind of this wash of sound. So that answers question number 5 a little bit there. The last thing to do is just to listen to this great piece of music. This comes again, Steve Reich Tehillim. It's the movement 1, so it would be the opening of the work. And again, they give you a really nice breakdown of how this piece unfolds over time. Beautiful, beautiful sounds here. So please check it out. Pause and check out this video. And if you want to learn more about Steve Reich, you can check out this video right here. Sometimes when people hear his music, it takes time just to get used to this slow-moving process, but I find it very relaxing, actually. This talks about how really this repetition is not meant to be boring. It's about the slow experience of his pieces. So this is a great short analysis of Reich's views on music and repetition. And also he talks about one of his other famous pieces called Music for 18 Musicians that is also uses similar compositional techniques. So if you want, you can check this one out. No homework question about it, but just an interesting look at a very influential American composer. Okay, we're getting back to Alarm Will Sound. And one of their other side projects, again, they work with many different composers and musicians. They had a whole album of orchestrating Aphex Twin, who is a kind of a popular DJ you can see right here at a 2008 Coachella performance. The members of Alarm Will Sound were brought together by their love for music like Tehillim. In their early years, they found a great deal of success staging concerts that highlighted the works of individual living composers. However, they also shared a passion for popular music, in particular, the innovative electronic dance music of Aphex Twin. Members of the ensemble began discussing the possibility and purpose of recreating Aphex's Twin music using acoustic instruments. So we're getting into one more question here, question number 6. According to founder Gavin Chuck, the idea was controversial. There were heated debates about the nature of digital versus acoustic sound, and of machine precision versus human about whether we should be as faithful as expressiveness. There were disagreements possible to the origins or interpretation more openly. So they're talking about how do we create this music that was made by a computer? How can we reproduce that with acoustic sound? That's a big challenge because you have these exact rhythm precision of a computer that you can create these digital musical selections. Despite the varied opinions about the merit of such a project, Alarm Will Sound eventually took it on. Their work culminated in the 2005 album Acoustica, which primarily featured arrangements taken from Aphex's Twins' 2001 album Drux. Whether or not all of the work required to make and record these arrangements was worthwhile is debatable. We will consider a track from Acoustica, Mount St. Michael's. One might argue that Alarm Will Sound's limited sound palette and acoustic means of production are inferior to the programmed beats, digitally refined timbres, and studio effects of Aphex Twin's original, or one might prefer, the sounds of orchestral instruments. It is hard not to be impressed by the skill of the arrangers J. Orff and P. McDonald, who translated Aphex Twin's track into an orchestral score, and by the individual performers, who placed complex rhythms and melodic gestures in exactly the right place. From Chuck's perspective, the strength of the project lay in its capacity to connect the ensemble with new audiences and put their artistic values on display. It became, in his words, an important platform from which to pursue a wide-ranging artistic vision that doesn't worry too much about genre, electronic versus acoustic, high modernist versus pop influenced, conventional classical concert versus multimedia experience. In short, by recording the works of Aphex Twin, Alarm Will Sound proved that they were eager to embrace good music from unexpected quarters. So in a way, they're kind of, letting us know that they value this electronic dance music just as much as they value the more high modernist classical music, you could say. And again, when you look at their concerts, this doesn't really look like a typical concert environment either. And if you look at this picture very closely, you can tell they clearly have a sense of humor just in some of the poses that they're doing too. Okay, so this next part is just where I want you to watch and listen to these two video examples here. On the right is the original Mount St. Michael from Aphex Twin. This would be all entirely electronically produced. And then on the left, we have the Alarm Will Sound cover, their orchestration, you will, of the same piece off of their album called Acoustica. So go ahead and check this out. It's really impressive how they're able to capture the sounds of this electronic track using their instruments. Just really well done orchestration. So go ahead, pause, check out both of those recordings. Now moving into question 7 territory here, we're moving on to our next important musician of the 21st and 20th century, Yo-Yo Ma. Perhaps the most visible and influential individual to make a career as a classical crossover artist has been cellist Yo-Yo Ma. His work has embraced a range of folk and non-Western musical styles, with the result that he has successfully bestowed his own cultural prestige on a large number of performers in traditions that might have otherwise not come into contact with the classical establishment. His projects have resulted in the creation of a lot of excellent music and the introduction of new sounds to classical audiences. Yo-Yo Ma was born in Paris to Chinese parents, but his family immigrated to the United States when he was 7. He first gained prominence as a child prodigy. Almost immediately after his arrival in the States, Ma played for Presidents John F. Kennedy and Dwight D. Eisenhower at a Kennedy Center benefit concert that was broadcast on national television. This was the first in a series of prominent performances and television appearances that introduced Ma to the American public. This is the video that shows Yo-Yo Ma performing on live TV in 1962. He was 7 years old, playing the cello here. It's kind of a smaller version of the cello for children, but still the same instrument. And then also his sister accompanying him on the piano. So she was a musician as well. So I would encourage you pause and check out this video here on slide 20. Now this is question number 7. So we already know a little bit about Yo-Yo Ma's upbringing. He was born as a child prodigy. He was on TV playing the cello for important musicians and presidents even. So it would make sense that he would really go into this classical concert career. Let's continue reading about him and answering this first question number 7 about him. After earning his bachelor's degree at Harvard University in 1976, Ma embarked on what could have been a typical concert career. He appeared as a soloist with orchestras around the world, collaborated with chamber musicians, and released recordings, 11 of which won Grammys between 1985 and 1998. The first of these award-winning recordings offered Ma's interpretation of the complete Bach cello suites, which we learned about in Chapter 12, a rite of passage for any cellist who wants to be counted among the greats. Ma still performs these pieces regularly, and has therefore developed a mastery of these pieces through a lifetime of study. He's presented the complete suites to crowds numbering in the tens of thousands at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles and the J. Pritzker Pavilion in Chicago, but he also plays movements from the suites at the one-year National September 11th Memorial Service, the funeral for Senator Edward M. Kennedy, and the service held to honor victims of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. Yes, so he plays at very many important events. I actually saw him play all of the Bach cello suites in Berkeley a couple years ago. It was an amazing, amazing musical performance. So I was very lucky to be able to see him play those. In 2019, he featured the prelude to Suite Number 1 in G major, certainly the best-known movement from the suites, in a video meant to express the many ways in which the arts bring communities together. He issued an invitation for people around the world to submit videos on the theme of self-expression and community building. Many of these were integrated in the final video. So you probably have heard this Prelude to Suite Number 1 in G major is the most famous of the Bach cello suites. Probably is the first thing that people think of when you think of the cello, actually. And so here is Yo-Yo Ma performing it, again, the G major prelude, and this also has some underscoring talking of him discussing the importance of the arts as well. So please check this out, and you can reflect on it for question number 8. And then part 2 of that is on the next slide. I wanted to show you guys one more of the cello suites. This is Bach's cello suite number 2 in D minor. This is the Sarabande, which is kind of a slow and stately dance. And again, very beautifully played by Yo-Yo Ma. So please watch these two, and for question number 8, reflect on both of the cello suites from J.S. Bach. Now let's continue with Yo-Yo Ma and cross-cultural collaboration. Despite his success on the concert stage, however, Ma soon embarked on a series of collaborations that brought him into contact with non-classical performers and genres. By doing so, he clearly indicated his belief that examples of good music can be found in all traditions, and that quality is determined by the level of execution and creativity that characterize the performance. So we saw these ideas before. The execution and the creativity he considers to be paramount. Doesn't matter what the genre is. Early in his journey, Ma collaborated with a team of world-class tango musicians to record The Soul of the Tango. This Grammy-winning album contributed to the elevation of tango from its undeniably humble roots. So this will be segueing into question number 9, and even question number 9. How does this elevate tango? Part of it is just, if Yo-Yo Ma is taking it seriously and records a whole album of tango music, obviously, and it wins a Grammy, then obviously it is worthy of being an elegant and well-known type of music that is taken seriously. Let's learn about the roots of tango, however. Tango originated in the slums of Buenos Aires, Argentina, in the late 19th century. A popular dance style, the tango is inherently international. It was driven by an instrument brought to South America by German immigrants, the bandoneon, a type of push-button accordion, seen here, and capitalized on the syncopated rhythms of rural gauchos, cowboys, and African slaves. The lyrics to early tango songs described the hardships of life in the slums, while the accompanying dance reflected the violence of knife duels, the characteristic posture of the good-for-nothing young man, and the ritualistic domination of the female dancer by her male partner. The tango rhythm is built on a quadruple meter framework with an emphasis on the second half of the second beat. So you can see that tango kind of had this rough history. It was really especially done as a couples dance. You can see the video here had kind of this association with maybe the underbelly of society in some ways, you could say. So that video shows a great example of tango. Maybe you want to go watch that on the previous slide. The tango is at first treated with contempt in its native Argentina. Here's more. The dance and itself, accompanying music, after all, were associated with poverty, seedy establishments, and questionable morals. In 1907, however, the tango made a hit in Paris, where it acquired cultural cachet. By the 1920s, it had been embraced around the world, but in the 1930s, its popularity began to fade, in part because the Great Depression excited an appetite for more cheerful music. So even though this music is beautiful, it's not necessarily cheerful. It does put you in more of a somber kind of mood, maybe, but still very enjoyable to listen to. Later in the century, however, Astor Piazzolla would reinvent the tango for the concert hall, composing nuanced and dramatic pieces that were intended for listening, not dancing. So again, music intended for the stage, but inspired by dance music, as we've seen before in this course. Interestingly, Piazzolla was inspired to highlight the tango music of his homeland after studying with the great French composition teacher Nadia Boulanger. She also taught Aaron Copland, who we discussed previously in the chapter, and gave him the confidence to create an American sound for the concert stage. In sum, she encouraged young composers to take more interest in highlighting the folk music of their homelands for the concert stage. So as you can see here, here's Astor Piazzolla studying with a renowned French composition teacher, Nadia Boulanger. she was really influential in helping these young composers finding their voices and really telling them to look to their homeland for inspiration. For Aaron Copland, it was looking to the folk music of America, the Appalachian region, and kind of the cowboy genre a little bit. And for Piazzolla, it was looking to tango music. And Piazzolla is still one of the best and well-known Argentine composers, and he also plays the button-style accordion called the bandoneon. We will consider Yo-Yo Ma's recording of Piazzolla's famous piece, Libertango, which he recorded with Leonardo Marconi on piano, Antonio Agri on violin, Hector Console on bass, Horacio Malvicino on guitar, and Nestor Marconi on bandoneon. The title incorporates the Spanish word for liberty, so libertango, a reference to Piazzolla's new style, which he launched with the 1974 publication and recording of this composition. Any performance of Libertango is immediately recognizable due to the catchy ostinato played by the bandoneon. The composition itself is fairly simple. After an introduction which establishes the ostinato and harmonic progression, we hear the A section twice. This is followed by the B section, which begins with contrasting material but concludes with a variation on the first half of the A melody. Then the ostinato returns, serving as a basis for improvisation. Throughout the recording, we can clearly hear the tresillo rhythm that is characteristic of much Latin American music. The rhythm has its roots in West African music, and it entered the Latin American mainstream when the traditions of enslaved Africans combined with the folk and popular practices of both indigenous peoples and colonial powers. The same rhythm can also be heard in African-derived musics of the United States, such as ragtime. The tresillo rhythm can be counted as 3 plus 3 plus 2. Each count is a half beat, such that one measure in quadruple meter contains 8 counts. So 3 plus 3 plus 2 is 8. In our recording of Libertango, the tresillo rhythm is heard primarily in the piano. So to count this, you could count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So it's a very popular rhythm called the tresillo rhythm, found all over Latin America. And that was question number 10. Using these terms, bandoneon, syncopated rhythms, quadruple meter, ostinato, and tresillo rhythm, write a short review of Yo-Yo Ma's Libertango. It would also help to look at this slide that shows a lot of the same terminology being employed at different times. And again, this was a short composition, so very worthwhile in listening. It's a very catchy piece of music and one that everyone should know, I think. So listen to this and then write your short review for question number 10, please. Now we're moving on to question 11 with a little bit of introduction information here first. At about the same time, Yo-Yo Ma also turned his attention to the folk music of the United States. He teamed up with celebrity fiddler Mark O'Connor and renowned bass player Edgar Meyer to record 2 albums, Appalachia Waltz and Appalachian Journey, each of which contained fiddle tunes, songs, and new compositions inspired by the American folk sound. The trio did not attempt to reproduce authentic performing styles. Instead, they brought their own skills and backgrounds to the creation of unusual arrangements that balanced traditional material with novel interpretation. We will consider their rendition of Fisher's Hornpipe from Appalachian Journey. This tune has been convincingly attributed to James A. Fisher, who served as music director at Covent Garden Opera House in London in the 1770s. It appeared as Hornpipe No. 1 in his 1978 collection of dance tunes. Whether or not Fisher composed the tune, it quickly gained popularity. Today, it can be heard all over the British Isles, in Canada, and in the United States, where it first appeared in print in 1796. There are countless versions, a symptom of the oral tradition, in which tunes are learned not from notation, but by ear. Appalachian fiddlers would most likely have learned Fisher's Hornpipe from traveling dance musicians and adapted it to their own tastes. So already seeing some familiar terminology about the oral tradition and how music is passed down in those cultures. For comparison, we might consider Tommy Jarrell's version of Fisher's Hornpipe, which we learned from his father. This is an example of the traditional fiddling style known today as round peak, named after a prominent geological feature near Mount Airy, North Carolina. Jarrell prides their harmony by playing multiple strings at the same time and rhythm by employing a syncopated bowing pattern. As such, he doesn't particularly require accompaniment. So again, we learned about Tommy Jarrell in the previous chapter, his take on fiddle tunes in the Appalachian region of the United States, specifically North Carolina, so and South Carolina as well. So this is Tommy Jarrell. Check out this great recording of Fisher's hornpipe, played all by Jarrell, supplying harmony by bowing on more than one string, playing these syncopated rhythms for accompaniment. Really is a great listening example. Now let's continue with Yo-Yo Ma. Ma and Company's rendition is quite different, so the same song, but different take on it. O'Connor is joined on the fiddle by bluegrass legend Alison Krauss. Although they play the same instruments as Jarrell, their technique could not contrast with his more greatly than it does. Each plays only a single melodic line and does so with great precision and clarity. The slower tempo allows each note to sparkle. Occasionally, we can hear vibrato, a technique that Jarrell would never employ. When accompanying the other instruments, O'Connor and Krauss evoke some of the same rhythms as Jarrell, but their renditions of the melody is less syncopated. Perhaps most importantly, the version of Fisher's hornpipe on Appalachian Journey takes the original tune far outside of its folk framework. So this is specifically your homework question. How does it take it outside of the folk tradition as well? When Jarrell plays Fisher's hornpipe, he simply repeats the A and B strains until he decides that it is time to stop. His version is in the key of D minor, and is most certainly stays there. O'Connor and Krauss, soon joined by Meyer and Ma, begin with a fairly straightforward rendition of the tune, but after a few times through, they switch to a groovy rhythmic pattern. Then, as Ma takes the melody, they modulate and change keys twice. Next, each player takes a turn with the A or B section, adding ornaments as if trying to outdo the person who played before. After this, they break into a polyphonic four-part version of the tune that includes several counter melodies. The recording ends with even more key changes in virtuosic high-range playing from Ma. So certainly they're adding a lot to this tune and taking it outside of the traditional framework, but still keeping the character of the tune, which I think is very important. So here you can listen to this rendition of Fisher's hornpipe, again, led by Yo-Yo Ma, but featuring Edgar Meyer on the bass, Mark O'Connor on the fiddle, and also Alison Krauss on the fiddle as well. And here's a nice breakdown of how they move through the tune. Okay, so hopefully you're all caught up on watching the listening examples. We're moving on to question 12 in our next section, which is the Silk Road Ensemble, another one of Yo-Yo Ma's many musical projects. Yo-Yo Ma's most significant and lasting foray outside of the European concert tradition, however, began in 1998 and has carried on into the present day. He founded the Silk Road Project with the aim of bringing together musicians and cultures from across the regions formerly traversed by the Silk Road, the trade route spanning from Italy to Japan that shaped Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia beginning in the 2nd century BCE. For Ma, the Silk Road was a symbol of intercultural exchange. For 2 millennia, the Silk Road moved clothing, artifacts, musical instruments, songs, stories, and religious beliefs from one end of the world known to the other. Ma has described the historical Silk Road as a model for productive cultural collaboration for the exchange of ideas and traditions alongside commerce and innovation, values that he wants to promote in the modern world. So this already is asking, what is the mission of Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble in some ways, but also how do they get their name for the group as well? Although the Silk Road Project has grown into a multifaceted arts organization, Silk Road that pursues a variety of initiatives, we will consider only the activities of the Silk Road Ensemble, a collective of international virtuosi who blend the instruments, styles, and techniques of various musical traditions. The ensemble contains nearly 60 members, although only a dozen or so perform together on any given occasion, and has been active across the globe. Its members record albums, 7 in the first 2 decades, give concerts, host festivals, and conduct clinics for students of all ages. So this gets more into specifically the Silk Road Ensemble. What is their mission? And what music do they play? How do they treat their source material? Let's read about that here on slide 34. The music played by the Silk Road Ensemble comes from a variety of sources. Sometimes individual members share traditional pieces from their own cultural backgrounds. The various performers then find a way to interpret the music in a way that makes sense to each of them, and the ensemble works together to develop creative arrangements. Sometimes the Silk Road Ensemble, like Roomful of Tea, discussed previously, commissions composers to write works for their unique performing forces and abilities. And sometimes the ensemble adapts pieces of music that have been written for other performers. In all cases, the repertoire blends cultural influences. However, it is very important to Yo-Yo Ma that the Silk Road Ensemble treat its musical sources with respect and avoid exoticizing non-Western musical traditions, like we saw happen in Tchaikovsky's The Nutcracker in Chapter 4. So that speaks to the last part of that question. How do they treat their musical resources? They treat them with respect. They don't exoticize them. They really try to understand and represent them in an authentic light, even though they are making their own modifications just due to the nature of their instruments. In some cases, they're still honoring the tradition and working and collaborating with those people who are bringing their culture and music to the table. We will consider one of Silk Road Ensemble's most popular numbers, Arabian Waltz. This piece was written and recorded by the Lebanese composer and oud player Rabi Abu Khalil in 1996. Although well-versed in traditional Arab music, Abu Khalil is equally knowledgeable of Western traditions, having studied flute at the Academy of Music in Munich, Germany. His compositions blend Arab scales, textures, and rhythms with influences from jazz, rock, and European concert music. Arabian Waltz was written for oud, pictured up here, you can see the oud, string quartet, a European ensemble, and traditional Arab frame drums. The original recording featured Abu Khalil in collaboration with the Belenescu Quartet, an ensemble led by Romanian violinist Alexander Belenescu that specializes in experimental music. So here's the recording of the original version of this piece, Arabian Waltz, that again has some cross-cultural influence in it already. The fact that we're using a string quartet with the oud and the Arab frame drums already has this kind of cross-cultural influence there. So you can listen to that, pause, and check out that video. Let's continue here, however. Clearly, Arabian Waltz was a cross-cultural work from its inception. In the hands of the Silk Road Ensemble, however, it has absorbed an even greater depth of international influence. We will consider a live performance that the ensemble gave in 2009 at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City. The ensemble on this occasion consisted of 2 violins, viola, cello, string bass, pipa, a Chinese lute, sheng, the Chinese mouth organ, shakuhachi, a Japanese flute, tabla from North India, and various Middle Eastern frame drums, and the zhanggu, a Korean drum. This is unquestionably an extraordinary assortment of instruments, each played by a master of the respective tradition. So this isn't quite the same, but you can just see here the diversity of some of the instruments that you might see at a typical Silk Road ensemble. We see the pipa from China, the string bass, the shakuhachi. This is a rik from Egypt, tabla, viola, bagpipes, and violin. So quite an assortment of instruments. The Silk Road's ensemble performance of Arabian Waltz begins just as Abu Khalil's had, with the sound of Arab frame drums. From the start, however, the ensemble members leave their unique stylistic fingerprints on this rendition. The principal melody is first heard in the shakuhachi, played by Kojiro Umezaki. Umezaki plays the melody itself unmistakably Middle Eastern in a Japanese style, introducing the typical embellishments that are idiomatic to the shakuhachi. Another remarkable contribution comes from the tabla player Sandeep Das, who likewise plays his instrument just as he would in a North Indian context. In the second half of the performance, Das is featured in a solo that combines the sound of the tabla with the other drums, producing an unprecedented aggregation of percussive timbres. So pause and please check out this great live version of Arabian Waltz by the Silk Road Ensemble, a new take on the same piece, but just the variety of instruments and the style that they bring to it is quite unique. So check out this recording here. A lot of good listening in these slides. Okay. And your question 13 was to listen to both recordings of Arabian Waltz and describe how does the Silk Road bring their own international influence to the piece while still retaining its character. So you can really only answer that, I think, if you really listen to both recordings. Okay, we're getting into our last section here, which is on the Art Ensemble of Chicago. So the first question can all be found here on slide 38. What are the accomplishments and musical influences of the Art Ensemble of Chicago in the 1960s and 70s? Originally comprised of saxophonists Roscoe Mitchell and Joseph Jarman, trumpeter Lester Bowie, bassist Malachi Favors, and later drummer Fumadou Don Moy, the Art Ensemble of Chicago enjoy a critical reputation as the most influential avant-garde jazz ensembles of the 1970s and 80s. During the late 60s and early 70s, the Art Ensemble helped pioneer the fusion of jazz with European art music and indigenous African folk styles. They also combined music from sanctified church services, minstrel shows, and bawdy houses of late 19th and early 20th century America, with a modernist spirit and lively stage show that involved face paint and costumes, as well as hundreds of musical instruments. A pronounced theatrical element was essential to their work. Its members attained a measure of jazz stardom on their own, particularly Bowie and to a lesser extent Mitchell, but in the Art Ensemble, no single player was greater than the whole. Whether it was the 1968 album People in Sorrow, the film score to Les Danses à Sophie, or the album with Fontella bass, the group's profound, groundbreaking recordings for ECM in the 80s and 90s, or with DIW in the new century, the Art Ensemble grew in stature and influence as ambassadors of avant jazz. All of its members were savvy composers and improvisers. So this is a really fantastic group that I think more people should know about, the Art Ensemble of Chicago. Insanely influential when it comes to avant-garde jazz. The group grew out of the Roscoe Mitchell Art Ensemble of the mid-60s, which had in turn grown out of Chicago pianist Muhal Richard Abrams' experimental band of the early 60s. The latter was a rehearsal band created for the purpose of playing scores written by many of the city's forward-thinking young Black American jazz composers. It attracted, among others, Mitchell, Jarman, and Favors. The two saxophonists had both served in the military, though not together. They met while students at Wilson Junior College. Favors had been an established member of the Chicago jazz scene since the 1950s. All three were early members of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, known as AACM, a collective organized by Abrams and several like-minded fellow musicians. By 1970, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, a willfully eclectic, wildly experimental collective originally led by saxophonist Roscoe Mitchell, was already a sensation of sorts in Paris. It had a motto, Great Black Music, which soon would be appended with a no less pointed second clause, Ancient to the Future. Bowie could have meant his comment to register in a few different keys. History was something to be channeled and challenged, as well as made. So this is going into question 15. What were the two mottos of the Art Ensemble of Chicago? They're listed right here, Great Black Music and Ancient to the Future. And then how does this tie into the notion of history? History was something to be channeled and challenged as well as made. So not only are they being influenced and channeling history through the music that they choose to present, but they're also challenging the notion of history and who gets to be on that stage or who gets to be in the modern eye, musically speaking. They're also making quite a lot of history too, due to the influence of their works. The irreducible power of the Art Ensemble rested in its alignment of forces. It was always a learning experience, reflects Mitchell, because I was lucky enough to be with 5 individual thinkers. This is going into question number 16. The group had striking visual iconography as well as a sonic aesthetic. So they not only had a unique sound, but also they looked the part too. They had very great costumes. Bowie took the stage in a lab coat. Favors and Moy wore African vestments and tribal face paint. Jarman evoked the East in his attire, while Mitchell typically dressed like an American businessman. So you can kind of see right here, too, the African style face paint, or the Eastern wear, the lab coat, and then also the kind of businessman. This is Roscoe Mitchell, who later became an NEA jazz master, and I was able to study with him actually. Great teacher, too. Always has kind of this businessman attire that he always sports. For question number 16, I want you to watch this short documentary on 2020 National Endowment for the Arts winner Roscoe Mitchell. He talks about his career in music and why it's important to always be learning. So I hope that you can get something from this and write about it for question number 16. Now, continuing into our next question here, more about the Art Ensemble of Chicago and their career as performing artists. Throughout the 60s, the members of the Art Ensemble of Chicago performed and recorded in numerous groups under various names. After critical acclaim in the national and international jazz press for their personal performances and recordings, Roscoe Mitchell, Joseph Jarman, Lester Bowie, and Malachi Favors decided to continue their musical adventures and traveled together to Paris in 1969, where they became known as the Art Ensemble of Chicago, an extension of the original Roscoe Mitchell Art Ensemble. Upon their arrival in Paris, they were immediately contracted to perform a one-month engagement at the legendary Théâtre Lucerne in Montparnasse. They also performed numerous concerts throughout France and proceeded to record albums as a group and individually in collaboration with the many important American musicians on the Paris scene in that period. In 1970, the group recorded the soundtrack for the French film Le Sens à Sophie, a cult classic featuring the voice of Fontella bass, and which was the first recording with new drummer Don Moy. In 1971, the group returned to the United States as a quintet and began their 6-decade history of performances and recordings on the international jazz circuit. The group has released more than 70 live performances, studio recordings, videos, and DVDs on a variety of labels, including Atlantic Records, ECM Records, Disc Union, Nessa Records, Delmark Records, Pi Recordings, and their own label, ECO Records, founded in 1975. Each member of the band was a highly proficient instrumentalist with a distinct personal voice and the pan-stylistic slant of the repertory, which could veer from boppish swing to early earthy funk to absurdist or dead serious abstraction, provided an ample opportunity for displays of prowess. The Art Ensemble of Chicago is renowned for its integration of musical styles that span the history of jazz and multi-instrumental group improvisations. And this is talking, again, question number 17. How do they display multidimensionality, collectivism, and how do the group serve as a platform for fostering each member's individual artistic voice? So first, each person was a highly proficient instrumentalist with their own unique musical voice. We'll see in the performances just how out they can get sometimes and how they can be doing many different things at the same time, but there's something still cohesive about it, I would say. And also this idea that they're spanning all the different musical genres sometimes in one performance. So incorporating all the history of jazz, but also this multi-instrumental group improvisation. They're composing and improvising on the spot quite often, in the moment, kind of playing. And you'll see that they all play tons of different instruments. Even though they might have their main instrument like drum set or saxophone, trumpet, they are all playing a ton of different percussion as well. So just the variety of sound is incredible. Their musical universe is enhanced by the creative use of unique sounds and percussion, also known as little instruments, like traditional hand and stick drums, whistles, horns, bells, chimes, vibes, marimba, gongs of all sizes, and an array of homemade and found sound objects that serve each individual musician as an extension of their personality on their principal instruments of saxophones, flutes, trumpet, and flugelhorn, double bass, and drum set. Their live performances of original compositions written by all the members have included elaborate costumes, face paint, props, theater, poetry, dance, and more to create a visual, auditory, and sensual spectacle. So again, they're not just trying to create a musical show, it's a visual show that you're seeing. It has, of course, the music, but it's also a sensual experience to see all of this and experience the theater of everything at once as well. So this picture is great. It shows all the members playing different types of hand drums. You see here one of their album covers. You see some of the variety of instruments as well. This is a huge bass saxophone that Roscoe Mitchell would have played, uh, featured right here. This theatricality and performative drama inherent to both their live shows and their recorded material added a new dimension to the excitement of jazz music. In his book, George Lewis describes that drama by quoting a concert review where writer Daniel Cow describes one of their early concerts. Listeners were surprised to see Joseph Germain, his naked torso and his face painted, passing slowly through the aisles murmuring a poem, while the bassist Malachi Favors, wearing a mask of terror, screamed curses at Lester Bowie, and Roscoe Mitchell operated various car horns. Here's another one. Possibly the most exciting quote featured in Lewis's book is a description of an outlandish art ensemble performance taken from a 1975 Downbeat review. So, Downbeat magazine. Bowie came out first, sporting a casino dealer's visor on his head and drinking from a pint of whiskey. Jarman and Moy staggered across the club like two winos, holding each other for balance, shooting off streamers and mumbling nonsensically. Bowie spotted them and yelled, "Over here! None of this music shit. We're going to play cards." Somehow they found their way to a table set up in front of the stage, where a deck of cards was produced. Bowie proceeded to deal furiously, cards flying everywhere, the three drinking and cursing each other in hilarious parody of a seedy card game, perhaps, or a parody of a jazz club. So they're going for a theatrical element, of course, in this too, not just focusing on music. This multidimensional and collectivist approach was congruent with the ideals of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, out of which the art ensemble first emerged. Germain and Mitchell were part of the brain trust that established the AACM in 1965. Germain performed on the organization's first official concert. Because the Art Ensemble of Chicago was the first AACM band to receive international acclaim, the group was sometimes conflated in those early years with the AACM itself, a source of some grumbling at the time, as George Lewis documents in his essential book, A Power Stronger Than Itself, the AACM in American Experimental Music. So what he's saying is that because the Art Ensemble of Chicago was one of the first AAC bands to really make it big, sometimes they became synonymous with each other when really they were two separate groups. The AACM was more of a collective that was about supporting different artists emerging, and the Art Ensemble happened to be one of those first groups that received international notoriety. This is a great book too, A Power Stronger Than Itself, which shows the AACM and experimental music. This is the Art Ensemble on the cover. George Lewis writes, the group's unusual hybrid of energy, multi-instrumentalism, humor, silence, found sounds and homemade instruments, and most crucially, extended collective improvisation instead of heroic individual solos, proved revelatory to European audiences, Lewis writes. Other artists under an AACM umbrella, like saxophonist Henry Threadgill and Anthony Braxton, were creating and thinking along these lines too, and continue to do so. So those are two other people that came out of AACM, for example. Now, this is important for question number 18. Not only what were the sounds of the universe, but also how is the AAC Art Ensemble of Chicago revelatory to European audiences? They mentioned quite a bit right here from the George Lewis book, but one of the things that we can point out is this idea of extended collective improvisation. So instead of one person having a solo where they can improvise and getting the spotlight, it's more about the collective improvisation and how can 5 or sometimes more musicians improvise at the same time and create something that has never been heard before and might not ever be heard again, right? In exactly that combination, probably never. So pretty revolutionary. These are 2 live performances. This isn't a homework question, but I wrote to you guys saying to really check out these performances. One's from 1974. These are both from the Montreux Jazz Festival. The other is from 1983. And they show the group just almost 10 years apart, but still amazing music happening in both of these performances. And again, it shows that one, the virtuosity, but also the variety of skill that each person in this band had, but also their ability to improvise and play together and create some really, really unique sounds. For me, I think about how much music and history and culture is being synthesized through each of these individuals. They're bringing all of their collective experience, an intergenerational experience of music too, into this platform and combining it together at once to create something that's new, where they also respond to each other and respect each other's sensibilities too. So again, these are two very amazing performances. I would check out a little bit of both of them. They're full concerts, so they are quite long. So I would encourage you to try to listen to maybe 10 minutes of one of them so that you can really get a sense of what they're going for. It does change quite a bit, even in 10 minutes, you'll see. And it's quite a lot of variety in each of these performances too. This is another slide of listening. These are actually individual tracks, and I tried to choose four things that really showed the wide-ranging talent and their ability to cross different genres and combine different genres. So this one is called Adwala, the theme. It is actually named after the Adwala Juice Company. I think that they had an association with them at one point. This is from one of their albums from 1979. This is a great song called Hail We Now Sing Joy that features some lyrics and some vocalizations as well. This is actually a cover of a Jimi Hendrix song, probably one of the most famous, called Purple Haze. And then this is named Malachi, named after the bass player Malachi Favors, and also a very, very heartfelt selection as well. So four very different tracks, but again, it shows the diversity of musical talent and genre just to be found in this group. Now let's continue with the AACM. This is question number 19. The Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, known as AACM, is a cooperative organization of musicians that became the leading influence on musical genre of free jazz. It is a nonprofit organization founded in May of 1965 in Chicago, Illinois, by Muhal Richard Abrams, Jody Christian, Steve McCall, and Phil Coren. According to its charter, the AACM is devoted to nurturing, performing, and recording serious original music. Also, while founded in the jazz tradition, the group's outreach and influence has touched nearly all corners of modern music. Early members included Henry Threadgill, Anthony Braxton, Jack DeJohnette, Wadada Leo Smith, Leroy Jenkins, Amino Claudine Myers, Adagoke Steve Colson, Chico Friedman, and the Art Ensemble of Chicago members, Lester Bowie, Roscoe Mitchell, Joseph Jarman, Famudu Don Moy, and Malachi Favors. In the 1960s, jazz music was losing ground to rock music, and the members of AAMC wanted to add creativity that could generate new audience. Pianist Muhal Richard Abrams, who had organized an experimental jazz band in 1962, was the driving force behind the founding of the AACM, I should say. The musicians were committed to their music despite a lack of performance venues and sometimes in different audiences. In the 1960s and 1970s, however, AACM members were among the most important and innovative in all of jazz. The musical endeavors of members of the AACM often included an adventurous mixing of experimental jazz, classical, and world music. Its members gave concerts or created scores that blended music, geometry, painting, and ciphers to be interpreted by the performers live. So some very revolutionary ways of thinking about creating music. And here we see a picture of the AACM circa 1968. Beginning in 1969, AACM organized a music education program for inner city youth. The association ran the AACM School of Music with classes taught by association members and also had a strong relationship with the influential sister organization, the Black Artist Group, BAG, of St. Louis, Missouri. The AACM has received support from the MacArthur Foundation and Columbia College. The AACM was part of a larger artistic movement on Chicago's South Side that included African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists, called Afrocobra for short, and various other artist collectives. Together, the organizations created spaces for performance, education, composition, and discussion, fueling Black collectivity through creativity, and more specifically, the improvisatory act itself. As older members moved away from Chicago, AACM school graduates such as Douglas Ewart and George Lewis took their place. The AACM musicians' discoveries in terms of sound color, fluid rhythms, structures, and free jazz lyricism continued to be influential in the 1990s. In 2015, a 50-year retrospective exhibition of art, music, and group-related artifacts entitled Free at First was held at the DuSable Museum of African American History. In 2016, their largest chapter is located in New York City under the leadership of one of the AACM's early members, Henry Threadgill. And here we see George Lewis, who is now one of the leaders of the AACM as well. Now we're moving into question 20. In what ways did the willingness to support each other, each individual member interests, help sustain the longevity of the Art Ensemble of Chicago? So like we saw with Roscoe Mitchell before, they were 5 free thinkers. So we have to see how does that work together. The personnel of the Art Ensemble of Chicago has changed several times with the early retirement and return of Joseph Jarman, the death of Lester Bowie in 1999, and the death of Malachi Favors in 2004. Jarman passed away in 2019, leaving only Moy and Mitchell from the original quintet. Undaunted, the pair rehearsed a 20-piece band under the AEC banner. Among its many participants were Jarabi Shahid, Nicole Mitchell, Moore Mother, Hugh Veragin, and Junius Paul. This large group traveled to Europe just before the COVID-19 pandemic shut down their live performances globally. In February 2020, they appeared at Paris, France's Maison des Arts de Créteil as part of the Son d'Hiver Festival. In January 2023, France's Rogue Art label released their performance as The Sixth Decade from Paris to Paris. The willingness to support each member's individual music interests and personal goals continues to contribute to the group's amazing longevity. For all of its focus on cohesion, the art ensemble also encouraged outside forays by its members. The intensity of the collective experience required that everyone have an independent vehicle and be able to develop their own project with the same dedication, says Moy. That avoids conflicts, and it keeps everybody fresh. So what he's saying in that statement, and again, this is question number 20, is that by each person being able to be free to explore their own musical path and then to bring it to the table for this collective group improvisation and the work of the art ensemble, it kept everyone fresh. It prevented people from having conflicts over ideas because you always had your own avenue to explore, and you knew that you could be free within the context of this group too. So this is a great quote to answer that question, and you can kind of elaborate upon that a little bit more. This is one of the early Art Ensemble Chicago records called With Fontella Bass, because it featured the singer named Fontella Bass, and it's the 1970 album. Really, really excellent stuff here. And it's different to hear them recorded versus to see a live show too. So definitely a different experience. This is another album that I highly recommend called Phase 1. It's the full album from 1971, also by the Art Ensemble of Chicago. Then as now, the Art Ensemble of Chicago was both a prominent AACM flagship and its own rogue vessel, disinclined to heed anyone else's navigation. Roscoe Mitchell maintains more contact with the AACM chapters in both Chicago and New York, and savors his place in the organization's pantheon. He has recently been a fountain of output, composing orchestral and chamber works, performing improvised sets with Lewis and AACM founder Muhal Richard Abrams, teaching at Mills College in Oakland, and making major statements like his stunning recent double album on ECM called Bells for the South Side. So these are some of Roscoe Mitchell's, one of the surviving Art Ensemble members' projects. Down below is a recording of Bells for the South Side a really great piece written for chamber ensemble with some great percussion. And then here is a recording of Frenzy House, a piece made for full orchestra and recorded at Mills College for this album. I was actually featured on this album and got to play some of the percussion parts, so very lucky to have been able to work with Roscoe Mitchell myself. Really important musician and still making some incredible art music. The reinvigorated art ensemble lineup bears some vestiges of that process. Along with Mitchell and Moy, it includes trumpeter Hugh Regan, cellist Tamika Reed, and two bassists, Jarabu Shahid and Junius Paul. These are all, as Roscoe Mitchell points out, part of the AACM family. They're also musicians with whom he has worked in other contexts, including his own bands. It's inspiring that they feel they still have so much to learn and practice and write, says Tamika Reed of the AACM elders she has worked with, Mitchell prominent among them. And this deep hunger to just get what they have out there. I feel like that's a lesson. Don't wait, just do it now. So this is your homework question is, in what ways have the AACM elders like Roscoe Mitchell inspired younger musicians such as cellist Tamika Reed? This is a great short interview of Tamika Reed and talking about her role as a jazz cellist. But I love this quote where she talks about what she's learned from older musicians of the AACM. I think really it comes down to this being inspired to constantly learn, practice, and create new music, and not to wait, just to go do it, not to wait for someone to give you permission, but just to make your art and then to just follow that fully. Very inspiring. She's a very influential figure to Tamika Reed. So watch that short take from her and then comment about her response on question number 21. And if you'd like to check out more of Tamika Reed, these are two great recordings. This is actually a live show of the Tamika Reed Quartet, and then this is from one of her albums called Old New. Both really, really fine examples of jazz music that is made today. The open question, and it may not be answered by the upcoming performances or even answerable at all, is how much the art ensemble can fulfill its original mandate in the face of so much change. There's never going to be another Lester Bowie or Malachi Favors, says Mitchell. I understand that. But we always said, hey man, if it gets down to one member, that's the art ensemble, you know? His statement checks out. We'll be together as long as one of us is still alive to carry on the word. That was Bowie speaking with Ted Pankin on WCKR in 1995. So as long as one of the members is still alive, that's still going to be the art ensemble. And as they add new members, that means I think it's going to still keep going. So the only certainty as the art ensemble embarks on its current journey is that the musicians in the group will be striving toward a high standard of shared intuition as improvisers and as members of a larger whole. History is on their side, as Jarman points out in his own way. I would not put anything against the idea of Art Ensemble of Chicago, he says. That band was and still is a powerful organization among itself. So here's again the original art ensemble group. And then I just love to see these pictures of Roscoe Mitchell now in the modern era, but back when the band was just starting too. Here's the conclusion of the chapter and therefore the conclusion of the textbook. These case studies have explored the expansive definitions of good music offered by recent Pulitzer committees, a leading art music ensemble, and one of the most famous living classical musicians. All have agreed that quality can be found in many genres and traditions. We might sum up their values according to the 5 criteria presented in the introduction of this chapter. Was every example in this chapter successful at fulfilling its stated purpose? We've looked at a lot of dance music. Did it inspire you to dance? Did Shaw's Partita change the way you think about the possible uses for the human voice? Did Marsalis's work song cause you to feel the suffering of his oratorio's protagonists? Was each of these examples exceptional when compared to others of its type? Is Lamar the best hip hop artist, and was Damn the best hip hop album of 2017? Is Tel Halim a particularly compelling example of minimalist composition? Are the works of Aphex Twin superior to those of other electronic music artists? Were Were these examples particularly original? Do they stand out from the field? Is there something about the musical details of Libertango that make it stick in your head? Does the originality of the vision behind the Art Ensemble of Chicago or Ellington's Far East Suite qualify it as better than other jazz compositions of the era? The skill of the performer, whether we are talking about Lamar's accomplished rapping, Roomful of Teeth's polished singing, Alarmable Sound's clever orchestrating, or Ma's exquisite cello playing, certainly contributes to the quality of each of these examples. Ma, in particular, has exhibited singular dedication to identity and collaborating with most accomplished performers from each global tradition. Flawless execution is central to his cross-cultural vision. But what about the skill of the composers? How can we judge that? Finally, what impact has this music had on society? As an enormously popular performer, Lamar has certainly had an impact. Will his legacy shape the future of hip hop? Copeland certainly defined the sound of Americanness for generations of composers. That makes him important, but doesn't make him good. The Art Ensemble of Chicago has inspired a new generation of jazz improvisers and composers. Shaw is still at the beginning of her career. Will future influence determine the quality of partita in some way? This book ends as it began, with a long list of questions. None of these questions will be definitively answered, but they are all worth asking. They are worth asking because we listen to music every day, meaning that every day we have the opportunity to engage with an art form that human beings have used to communicate, entertain, and even shape the course of history for tens of thousands of years. We can either listen passively or we can ask questions of what we hear. These questions lead us to listen with greater care, extract more from the music in our lives, and discover new things about the world around us. And this will be your last homework question, asking about what are some takeaways that you can get from this class. I think that this slide here has some good examples, some good ways of thinking about it, but you can also combine your own takes as well. I'm always curious to see what students learn and what they take away from a semester of study in music. And that'll bring us to the end of the chapter with our resources for further learning, some great information about some of the musicians that we learned about throughout this chapter 13. And hope you guys enjoyed doing your last assignment. And again, have a great rest of your semester. Start working toward your end of the semester projects.